What's up, everybody, and welcome into the Crime and Mafia podcast. This is episode 2, and I am Jeff Nadu. Hope you're all having a great day. Hope you're having a great week. Obviously, we are still, most of this country, under quarantine, but we continue to hope to see brighter days ahead. I hope you're all are enjoying your time with your family and able to find some solace in the fact that, eventually we will get back to normal. Really enjoyed last week's episode. A lot of you tuned in, a lot of you checked in, and I got to tell you, I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of feedback that I got. People seem to really enjoy the show we did on the Black Mafia in Philadelphia. If you haven't been able to check that out, make sure you go check it out on my channel. This week, we have a really interesting show. It's going to be about the Mafia Cops. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, two of the most corrupt individuals in the history of American law enforcement. It really shines on the fact of policing in America currently. We all know the issues that police face on a regular basis, sometimes on their own merit. However, in this case with these two, it was truly deceit, treachery, and downright evil conducted by these two, and we'll get into them. We'll delve deep into them. And before I get into the show, I really want to make this clear. The show is going to involve basically 4 different individuals. Now, we're going to throw in some connections and some relations, but the 4 individuals that are going to be really important in this discussion are obviously the Mafia Cops themselves, Eppolito and Caracappa, 2 police officers, and the other 2 people that are going to provide very important in this discussion are Anthony Casso. They called him the gas pipe, who was a Lucchese crime family underboss, and Burton Kaplan, who was a Jewish gangster that we'll get into as well. So, those are all important names. And, really with this show and what I've always looked to do and what I will continue to do is I want to highlight people that maybe you haven't heard of, guys that are new to you. We can all talk about Al Capone and John Gotti, but it's important to highlight some of the real treachery that went on in the mob and in crime by some of these guys that aren't necessarily, out there as much as some. So here you have it, the Mafia Cops. Sit back, relax, and let's get after it. The Mafia Cops obviously were made up of Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito. Louis Eppolito was actually born in 1948. He was born in a family in Brooklyn. Interestingly enough, his father and cousins and uncles were all mob connected. His father, Louis Eppolito's father, Ralph, was a pretty prominent member of the Gambino crime family. His uncles, James and James Jr., were also made members in Nino Gaggi's crew. For anyone that's not clear who Nino Gaggi is, he was connected heavily with Roy DeMeo and Paul Castellano. So growing up, Louis Eppolito was very connected. He worked in his father's gambling hall. He became kind of an errand boy in that mob hall. If you've ever seen Goodfellas, he basically worked similarly to how Henry Hill came up. And growing up, Louis, his father basically beat it into his head, not literally, but figuratively, that cops were no good. Cops were the scum of the earth. Cops we hated. And surprisingly enough, he ends up becoming a cop later in life. But the mob life was very much a part of his life growing up. His father actually passed away when Louis was at a young age, and he took it pretty hard. He actually fell under an illness, and after he got through the illness, he actually, as a teenager, became a big-time bodybuilder. He won several competitions in New York City, and at that point, he found out that being a bodybuilder wasn't going to pay the bills. So he decided to go get a job. He got a job with the Postal Service working in New York City. And after kind of a run-in with a manager, he decided that, he wasn't going to take fucking errands all day. And, I think a lot of people thought Louis would go into the family business, get involved with the Gambino crime family, which, would have probably worked out better for him because he ultimately wouldn't have had to disgrace the badge. It's important to discuss that when you're just talking about Eppolito and Caracappa, when they in the 60s were coming up, it was important to mention that New York had a major issue. They needed police officers badly. There was a big shortage of officers. There was a lot of crime being perpetrated throughout the city. You had race relations issues. You had all sorts of stick-ups and robberies. You had a lot of issues. And the police department was willing to look past certain factors. Now, after Lewis decided to quit the Postal Service, he had started doing some bodybuilder training, if you will. He actually started training a few friends of his, and one of his friends was actually training to become and take the police exam. So Lewis decided that, hey, why don't I go become a cop? I can get a good civil service job and get on a pension down the road and set my family up. At that point, he had a young family, and he was looking really for a decision that would shape his career. At that point, he took the exam. He passed with flying colors. The problem was, if you know anything about police departments, generally any connection to known felons or felon committing would, obviously preclude you from being hired. But as I said, the inability of, the police department to find willing individuals to work there, they were almost forced to hire people that necessarily shouldn't have been hired. At that point, he becomes an officer in the 63rd Precinct, which, the 63rd Precinct was his precinct growing up. It's where he lived. Basically handled that part of Brooklyn that he had lived in his entire life. It basically, covered, that Flatbush, Borough Park, kind of Windsor Terrace area just south of Crown Heights. So he really kind of was from that area, Midwood, that area. So it was kind of interesting that he ended up patrolling that area. Stephen Caracappa was born in Staten Island to kind of a different family. Stephen Caracappa was really a part of a fine family. They were a working civilian family. They both had decent jobs, his parents. But for Caracappa, it was kind of a different childhood. Growing up, he was friends with Thomas Bellotti. Thomas Bellotti, who many people might remember from his role in the Paul Castellano murder. He was actually the driver that night when Paul Castellano was murdered in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Bellotti was the driver. And coming up as a child, Stephen Caracappa was friends with Thomas Bellotti, and that actually comes to a head later in the Mob Cop's career, which I'll get to. Coming up, Caracappa was a lanky, tall fella. He didn't have many prospects. He actually worked for a lumber yard. He did odd jobs. But like most young men, he decides to start hanging out with the wrong people. And he decides to rob a different lumber yard. He ends up, a friend of his, making away with some building supplies. He was arrested and booked for grand larceny. At that point, the grand larceny charge stuck. He decided to, with no real prospects, to go into the military. He served in Vietnam in the Army. And he came back to New York really in better shape. He had kind of taken a wrong turn in his life, and as Eppolito, he needed a civil service job. He decided that, hey, why not go be a police officer? The department's in need, and generally my larceny charge would preclude me from being a police officer, but in knowing that they need officers, why not go join? So both these guys had negative remarks that would preclude them from being police officers, but as I said, the need was there. So they both make their way into the department. They become patrol, and they get on with the police department. Now, for Caracappa, he actually comes and becomes a pretty decent, decorated police officer. He starts out as a patrolman. He starts doing some stuff in the robbery unit. He does some really good things there. And, surprisingly enough, they're both promoted to detectives. They become acquaintances and started working together. They, especially, as I said, Caracappa helped set up the organized crime homicide unit. They both became pretty detailed and decorated police officers. It wasn't until 1984 where uh, Louis Eppolito really starts to decide that, he knows that at that point the allureness, the elusiveness, and the lure of making some quick money could really be kind of an addition to his ability to make money as a patrolman. In 1984, the FBI, knowingly raids a home of a New Jersey mobster. His name was Rosario Gambino. He was a major heroin trafficker, and he was the cousin of boss Carlo Gambino. During the raid, they obviously find Gambino, but they also find a file folder in a ceiling tile, basically with intelligence records from the police department. And at that point, they're thinking, well, how the hell did he come in contact with these? Obviously, he had to pay someone in the police department to get these. The detective's office decides to run fingerprints on them, and they find Louis Eppolito's fingerprints. At that point, they start conducting an investigation, and they suspend Eppolito. And upon, obviously, administrative and criminal charges, he faced termination. Instead of basically saying, I'm just going to walk off into the sunset, at least I can keep my pension, and I can move on, Eppolito decides that he's going to fight the charges. Now, again, if he fights the charges and loses, he would obviously risk his job, and he would be out on the street with no pension. So it was kind of surprising that he fought it. He then fights the bill. He gets a pass. They basically decide, the judge, that there was no belief that he actually touched the documents. They may have been placed there, his fingerprints, Layton's, something like that. There was no real proof that he actually handed the documents. They had maybe come in contact with many different people, and the fact that he may have touched them at one point had no bearing on the fact that they were in the house of a mobster. So he ends up getting off scot-free. Returns to the force. He gets all sorts of back pay. And he actually said in the paper that nothing short of clearing my name could replace the tears my family cries of this. So he basically plays the victim, and it ends up working out for him. Around this time, though, his continued mob connections really started setting a fire under Eppolito. In the early 80s, Eppolito had a cousin named Frank Santora. Frank Santora was a Gambino family associate. He was a low-level mobster, and he was serving prison time in Pennsylvania, where he got chummy with an inmate named Burton Kaplan. Now, for anyone that doesn't know who Burton Kaplan is, Burton Kaplan was a New York, by many accounts, New York legend. He was a garment dealer. He dealt in the garment district for many years. He was a mobster. He had a wholesale clothing business, and a lot of his business was done illegally. He did a lot of stuff with Anthony Casso and several other mobsters, and he was an old school guy. He lived by the code. He lived by omerta. Even though he was Jewish and was unable to be a made man, he did a lot of big time things in the mob. At that point, he was in prison. He met with Santoro, and Santoro basically told them that when they got out, he had a cousin that was willing to trade information for cash. And for anyone like Burton Kaplan, that was a huge connection. He also knew that he had connections to Anthony Casso, and at that point, Anthony Casso was a large and high riser in the Lucchese crime family. Anthony Casso was doing big things, and he knew that not only Kaplan but Casso could benefit highly from having some connections in the police department. So at that point, Burton Kaplan gets out of prison, and he agrees to go speak to Casso. As the little investigation into Louis Eppolito went kind of by the wayside, they all became kind of police officers again. They went back into just their regular jobs. As I said, they continued to make ascensions and rises in the police department. Nearly kind of 10 years, or I'm sorry, 5 years later, Anthony Casso decides that, he had been, obviously, like I said, a large riser in the family, and he became to develop a large crack with the Gambino crime family. He had basically ordered the murder of Frank DiCiccio. Frank DiCiccio was the underboss of John Gotti, and at that point, Frank DiCiccio parks his car. He decides to go meet John Gotti. He goes back into his car later, and his car blows up. So, Casso was a direct link to ordering that hit. And there was a big crack developing between Casso and John Gotti. He also had some run-ins with Roy DeMeo. And, a lot of people wanted Anthony Casso dead. They had reasons to want him dead. And, he had to fear for his life. The problem was Casso, he didn't have to fear anything. He was Anthony Casso. He had, he was a lunatic, by the way. He was a dangerous character. He had come from a mafia family himself. And really in the 80s, the crack developed, and Casso was actually in Brooklyn meeting some associates. When he was in his car, some hoods ran up to him and actually tried to kill him. They were able to wound him. He ended up surviving and obviously wanted some revenge. That was the point that he contacted the Mafia Cops. Now, as Burton Kaplan comes out of jail and connects with Casso, Burton Kaplan had his own reasons for wanting to know who the Mafia Cops were. And this was really the first time the mob cops went from selling just information and, tips and stuff to committing conspiracy to commit murder and murder for hire. Burton Kaplan had many associates that he dealt with, and one of his big rackets was he would steal treasury bills. And at that point, the treasury bills were big things in the 80s, and he had an associate that he was dealing with that he had reason to believe was ripping him off. And he had feared that this guy, Israel Greenwald, was going to go to the police about him and basically rat him out. So he needed to make this guy go away. He contacts the Mafia Cops and basically tells them, look, I need you to find this guy. I need you to go with your cousin, Frank Santori. I need you to go find this guy and take care of him. The mob cops pull him over, Greenwald, basically as a civilian stop. They tell him they need to speak to him and take him to the station. He obviously willingly gets in the car. They take him to a Brooklyn garage on Nostrand Avenue, and basically Santoro murders him, and they actually bury him in the basement of the garage. So that was the first time that the mob cops basically, that was where it really went from, okay, we could just fire you, to now you're committing criminal, bad criminal charges. And, that's when they really kind of made that ascension. They were paid for their efforts, and the reverberation of, hey, we have some guys now that are willing to help us out, not only from tips, but murder as well. And Casso took notice. Casso, obviously being wounded, wanted revenge for the attempted hit on his life. So he contacts the mob cops as well and says, look, I know who did this. Now, obviously, in any criminal family, there are low-level associates and guys that are willing to do bidding for mob guys. And one of them was a kid named Jimmy Hydell. Jimmy Hydell was kind of a young hood from Brooklyn. He lived in South Brooklyn. He had started to do the bidding for mob guys. He started doing, robberies, stealing cars, low-level hits, and he was actually, according to many, one of the shooters in the Casso attempted hit. So Casso became, incensed. He wanted Hydell, and he wanted to not only kill him, but he wanted to torture him. So he contacts the mob cops. They, as usual, do their typical pullover, and they find Jimmy Hydell in Brooklyn. They take him to Casso. Casso decides that, and this was Casso's thing, he would not only kill you, but he would torture you. He would do horrible things to you. He would, as far as torture is concerned, he would, use chainsaws. He'd cut people's hands off. He would really make you suffer. And that was really the concern whenever Casso was involved. He finds Hydell. They take him to Casso, and Casso basically tortures him. Casso pays the mob cops a nice sum of $30,000, and that was it. Now they're in. There's no more screwing around. They're now basically on the payroll of Casso, and that was where it really started to get interesting. It's interesting. Casso called them his crystal ball, and he actually started paying them $4,000 a month to just give them intelligence records. It was really kind of an amazing turn of events. They were making big time money. These guys, they were starting to be able to buy things they didn't normally buy. They were starting to provide more for the family. Even Louis Eppolito bought a nice house. These guys started to do some things they normally wouldn't do. And a lot of the reverberation of really these bodies turning up, there was just a lot of bidding that needed to be done. There was also a really sad story in Brooklyn. Anthony Casso asked Burton Kaplan to find another guy that may have been involved in the attempted hit on Casso's life. It was a guy named Nicholas Guido. And Caracappa basically used the police identification system to locate this guy, or what they thought was this guy. Casso basically finds this Guido, and they send a hit squad to kill this guy. The problem was they killed the wrong guy. The shooter basically fires just some rounds into a car, and the problem was it was the wrong Nicholas Guido. The Nicholas Guido they killed was just a regular civilian. He was a telephone installer, and he was basically a young kid. It turned out that the info was wrong, and that the Nicholas Guido they wanted actually lived upstate. And there was a lot of problems with that hit because, there's in the mob a lot of the time, well, in fact, 100% of the time, the killing people that are involved in the life, the killing people that are direct connections. Nicholas Guido was not connected to the life. He was a regular, just Italian kid that liked his car and working on telephone lines. That's what he was. And Burton Kaplan was furious about this. Burton Kaplan, as I said, was an old school guy. He lived by the code. He lived by not involving civilians. And this is where the crack really developed for the mob cops. Obviously, after this, they continued killing people. And throughout their reign of murder and terror, they actually ended up killing 10 different people. They were paid almost $400,000 for their transgressions. It was really not until 92 where the end started to come for the Mafia Cops. And this is probably the most fascinating hit that they committed. I mentioned that when Caracappa was coming up, and what's interesting about the mob cops is they were so interestingly, kind of when you see pictures of them, it's interesting because Caracappa was kind of that tall, lanky, quiet guy. Eppolito at this point was kind of an overweight, kind of plump detective that was full of life and loved to talk. They really kind of fit each other well, and they looked like partners. They looked like typical New York detectives. Eppolito is very, it always has to have his tie a half off and his shirt opened up. Eppolito was, as I said, a bon vivant, if you will. And Caracappa was more of a reserved, quiet, strong, silent type. So it was really kind of interesting. But as I said, when Caracappa was younger, he had a lot of connections to Tom Bellotti. They were childhood friends. And a lot of people believe that one of the final hits that the mob cops committed was his allegiance to Tom Bellotti. Tom Bellotti obviously was connected to Paul Castellano. And when those two were killed that night in Manhattan, there was a 6-hit squad set up to kill those two. And one of those guys was reportedly Eddie Lino. Eddie Lino was a Gambino captain. He was from a heavy mob family. And it was talked that he was involved with that hit on Bellotti and Castellano. So there was a lot of reason to want Lino dead. And actually, Anthony Casso wanted him dead as well. So he offered them 65 grand. And I think if you ask Caracappa, he probably would have did it for much less. He wanted Lino dead. He killed his childhood friend, and loyalty doesn't fall far from Caracappa. They ended up spotting Edward Lino on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. And as Lino's pulling off the parkway off an exit, the cop lights go on. Now, obviously, anybody's going to pull over. And at that time, Lino was driving a really nice Mercedes. So they pull up. They obviously approach the vehicle. Lino is asked for his license and registration. He goes for the license and registration. At that point, Stephen Caracappa shoots him 9 times. And that was that for Eddie Lino. So all in all, like I said, 10 different people were killed during this time. By the late 80s and into the 90s, there was a lot of heat in New York. There were a lot of internal investigations going on. If you've ever seen the 7-5, it's another documentary involving police corruption. If you look in Brooklyn, a lot of the police departments were having major corruption problems, including the 75th precinct, other precincts. And at that point, the mob cops decide that, look, it's time for us to ride off into the sunset. We've done enough. We've made enough. We can go live our lives, and no one will ever figure this out, because they had felt like at that point, they were off scot-free, because they knew, or they thought they knew, that Anthony Casso is never going to cooperate. Everyone we've killed, they're not going to cooperate. And Burton Kaplan was a rock. So let's retire and let's move on with our lives. They weren't going to get indicted, so that was great. They decide we're going to move away. So they decide to move to Las Vegas. Eppolito starts... And this was kind of Eppolito's major issue. And this is one of the things that really ended up bringing him and Caracappa down. If he would have just shut up and went out to the Vegas area and just lived his life, he may have not had a bigger problem. But, and that's what Caracappa did. Caracappa moved out to Vegas and really just became a regular guy. I mean, he had his pension check. He got a job at a local prison in North Las Vegas. And lived his life. But Eppolito, unfortunately, like other gangsters, like your John Gotti's or Nicky Scarfo's, they love the spotlight. They crave the spotlight. And the problem with crime is, when you crave the spotlight, you will not be free for very long. And Eppolito, he had this view that he was a screenwriter. He was like this big time Hollywood screenwriter. And he started taking roles in movies. And if you've ever seen Goodfellas, he's actually in Goodfellas. He doesn't have a speaking role, but actually he does it's a small speaking role. But he was actually, if you watch the scene where Henry Hill introduces everyone in the bar, he actually is introduced as Fat Andy. I want to say he says "What's up, guy?" or something. He has some sort of speaking role. But that was his first major role. He appeared in some other films as well, including Lost Highway, Predator 2. He also wrote a book, which was wild. He wrote a book basically discussing his family's role in the mob, which he spoke of his attempts to avoid being dragged into the criminal life, as he called it, and basically his role in the Rosario Gambino corruption case. He became kind of the social justice warrior that I think when you're someone that gets away from stuff you can't do. He decided to basically hang this out and say, fuck you guys, you persecuted me and I'm a good guy. He went on these book tours. He actually appeared on Sally Jesse Raphael promoting his book. He really did some stupid things. And in 1994, he actually decided that he wanted to get out of the film life, and he actually started selling cars at an Infinity dealership. So for the mob cops, it was kind of life as usual. But during this time, Caracappa became incensed by Eppolito's continued obsession with being the center of attention and basically toiling with the federal government and with the NYPD. The NYPD had their own problems, but I mean, for him to just basically blatantly throw it out there that he was going to go and live his life was was really crazy to do. At that point, the cops were kind of closing in on Anthony Casso. Anthony Casso had committed many crimes. It was basically time for Casso to pay for his crimes. The issue was, and this is where the end came, Anthony Casso basically decides that he wants to cooperate. The issue for him was nobody was buying the lies that he was telling. No jury believed him. No detective believed him. No one believed him. And he basically, the deal that they had cut for him went by the wayside. So it kind of backfired because he wanted to cooperate and he started spilling his details to everybody. It ended up not working out for him because he then had to go to prison anyway. And he still to this day says he didn't do anything wrong. He ended up, though, really fucking the mob cops and really started kind of throwing out there that he had people for hire. The problem was no one believed him. He actually went on 60 Minutes, and it's on YouTube if you want to watch it. He talks about, hey, I have 2 cops on my payroll. Their names were Eppolito and Caracappa. And I believe it was Ed O'Neill, discussed this glowingly with Casso, that saying, hey, I had these, but no one believed him. You couldn't use his testimony. It was really just testimony. The real problem that came for them was during the book tour that Eppolito went on. It was really dumb luck. Eppolito appears in Sally Jesse Raphael. Now, in the 90s, most homemakers at that time watched Sally Jesse Raphael, and it wasn't until 2003 that Betty Hydell, who was Jimmy Hydell's mother, was watching Sally Jesse Raphael, and she notices Eppolito. And she recognizes Eppolito as the last person that she saw her son with. I guess according to Hydell, her son was in front of her home when they picked him up. And she saw him out the window get put into the cop car. And from that day on, she never saw him again. So Betty Hydell contacts the New York Police Department, and a young detective, Tommy Dades, basically starts looking into the case. He took all the evidence to the Brooklyn DA, and basically they launched probes into Caracappa and Eppolito. They also found out that Caracappa knowingly searched Nicholas Guido's name a week before he was murdered as well. So they were closing in on the mob cops, but again, they didn't have enough necessarily to put them away. It wasn't until 2006 where that's where the end came. At the age of basically 72, an old friend came and emerged. Burton Kaplan at the time was arrested for running a marijuana ring. Now, even after the cops moved to Las Vegas, they still had maintained connection with Burton Kaplan. So for the police department, another issue they had was the statute of limitations ran out on Caracappa and Eppolito. So they had to make a connection that Eppolito and Caracappa still had maintained contacts with someone in New York. That person was Burton Kaplan. Now, keep in mind, Burton Kaplan said in most of his entire life, he hated informants. He would never become an informant. But he decided that in his final golden years, he wasn't going to live them in a cell. At that point, he had children and grandchildren, and he didn't want to live his final days in a 9x6 cell. At that point, he decides that he's going to cooperate with the federal government, and that was really the death nail for the mob cops. Kaplan decides to cooperate, and he was granted release in 2006. Now, by definition, Burton Kaplan is an informant and a rat. However, I think there are certain details that you can state that would obviously make it clear that there's nothing worse than a dirty cop. And Burton Kaplan ended up being the death nail for the mob cops. There was a ton of fallout from the mob cops, and they ended up actually being convicted and sentenced. In 2006, the mob cops were sentenced to basically life. And when you talk about Caracappa and Eppolito, the reverberations of their issues, and Eppolito was sentenced to life plus 100 years. Caracappa got life plus 80 years. They're both fined $4 million. But the fallout really came from the other things that came out in the trial. It was a long debacle. They had to pay a ton of wrongful death suits out. They ended up having to pay $10 million to a guy that had to do 20 years in prison after he was framed for the murder of a prostitute that Eppolito and Caracappa killed. They also granted $5 million to the family of Nicholas Guido. There was all sorts of reverberations from their issues. Now, a couple of updates. Burton Kaplan actually died in 2009, 3 years after he was released from prison. He actually was in the witness protection program, and he died at the age of 75. So for basically 72 years of his life, he was a stand-up guy. In his last 3 years, he became an informant, but he lived his life in non-paranoia, basically. But he died in 1975, and he was really, as I said, the death nail to the mob cops. Anthony Casso is actually still alive. He is 77 years old, and he was basically he's been moved around. He actually served some of his sentence at ADX Florence, one of the most secure prisons in the country. He was then moved to Federal Medical Center in Buechner, North Carolina, after he had prostate cancer. He then went back to Florence, and as of 2013, he is in what they call federal residential reentry offices. It's not a prison facility, but more of a home confinement halfway house. And currently he's actually at USP Terre Haute. So his health is obviously not good. He still maintains to this day that he didn't do anything. He basically tells the government that they basically fucked him and everything. And he told organized crime reporter Selwyn Rabb that it's really a fucking joke that he's still in jail. So, Casso, who is a dangerous guy, he's likely to die in prison. The mob cops, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, have both died. Actually, Caracappa had cancer. He actually lost an appeal to overturn his conviction in 2016. Several months later, he filed a compassionate release, and the judge basically answered to him that there's nothing he can do. He died in 2017 at 75 in a federal prison in North Carolina. Louis Eppolito actually lived really up until recently. He died in November 2019 in USP Tucson, a high security prison in Arizona. And to this day, Louis Eppolito has maintained that he had done nothing wrong. His family has been on a milk carton for years saying that he's never done anything wrong. Louis Eppolito is a delusional person. His family are delusional people. And up until his death, he maintained that. Actually, at his sentence, he was quoted as saying, the federal government can take my life. I'm a man. They can't take my soul. They can't take my pride, and they can't take my dignity. I was a hardworking cop. I never hurt anybody. I never kidnapped anybody. I never did any of this. So, even after his sentencing, he has still maintained that he did nothing wrong. It's interesting, not only from the Black Mafia, but the Mafia Cops. The big word is reverberation, and the reverberation in present day is out there. We've seen over the years the amount of corrupt cops to come out, and to this day we find corrupt cops. I don't think it's serious to say, or not serious to say, that these are two of the most corrupt police officers in the history of modern law enforcement. Obviously, we've seen corrupt cops do things bad, but not to this level, not to the level of killing people and committing robberies and kidnappings and all sorts of things, really heinous crimes that really. And it really sucks because most of Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa's life, they spent on the outside. They really only did about 10 years in prison. But you look at the delusion that both of them had. Even to Stephen Caracappa's respect, I mean, he went on 60 Minutes as well, and talked about how he would never do this. Why would he disgrace the badge and his family's name for money? But they're really fascinating guys. I mean, all the guys, Burton Kaplan, Casso, Eppolito, and Caracappa, all fascinating guys that really disgrace the name. And it's amazing because if you go back to the 60s when they were originally hired, if the police department didn't need police officers so badly, it's likely that they never get into the mob ever. Problem was, Louis Eppolito always had a backup plan. He could always go become a mobster. It's amazing that in a 50,000-man police force, they found each other. It's truly fate. But that's that. There you have it. The Mafia Cops, two of the more interesting people in mob history, and in in law enforcement history. Hope you all enjoyed the show. Hope you all have a great day, and make sure you check out next week's show. I've not decided who we're going to talk about yet, but we have plenty of names to throw in. I've heard about maybe do Richard Kuklinski. I've heard Tommy Patera. I've heard Kabani Savage. I've heard Vincent Gigante. We'll get to all of them and more. I also want to do maybe a Q&A of some sort. So if you have any Q&A that you want to do, you have a question you want me to answer, I'm thinking about maybe doing a Q&A for the first couple minutes of the show. So if you have a question, make sure you leave it in the comment box below. And make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss another Crime and Mafia podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. We'll see you next time here on the show.